call Grant Robertson.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair. And actually, I do want to pick up on the points that Materia Ture was making in her contribution. And I too want to refer to the regulatory impact statement, which, as the previous speakers have outlined, gives us what the government's objectives are for the legislation. And it's on the basis of these objectives that the Labor Party is supporting this legislation, because we too agree with the idea of protecting the public from reoffending and providing greater support for the reintegration of returning offenders. I would venture to suggest everybody in the House shares those objectives. So then when we follow those objectives through to the purpose clause, Mr Chair, things start to go slightly astray in terms of meeting the objectives. So the purpose clause, the purpose of this Act is to obtain information from returning offenders and establish release conditions for offenders returning to New Zealand following a prison sentence of more than 1 year in an overseas jurisdiction. Well, it certainly could be argued that that represents some steps towards Objective 18.1 in the regulatory impact statement, the protection of the public from reoffending. This getting the necessary information is an important part of that. What I want to focus on in this part of my contribution is that I think it fails completely to talk about Objective 18.2, the providing of greater support for the reintegration of returning offenders. And I do that on the basis of looking at the options that the government considered when deciding what to do in this area. And as best as I can tell, having read the regulatory impact statement, read the bill, not had the benefit of a select committee process where this would have been discussed in some detail, and submissions would have been sought from the likes of the Law Society, for instance, who probably would have provided some pretty good advice right at this point on whether or not the actual drafted law meets the objectives of the government and the purpose clause fulfills their role. So having had a look at that, it's fairly clear that what are options 3 and 4 in the regulatory impact statement, a mandatory supervision regime and a discretionary supervision regime, elements of both of those is what we've ended up with in the law in front of us. And if we then go to those two parts of the regulatory impact statement and see what the officials thought those two options did for the principle of reintegration that should be core to the purpose of this piece of legislation. And under the mandatory supervision regime, the officials concluded there would be good support for reintegration. However, they highlighted the risk that a mandatory system will treat all returning offenders as a homogenous group with similar reintegration needs. Offenders will return for a broad range of offences, and a formal system of supervision for a significant proportion of the offenders would mean that there would be a significantly higher level of support to reintegrate in the status quo. Now that will work for those people, Mr Chair, if they get onto the conveyor belt of support in terms of the of what's defined in this part of the bill as a standard release condition. Where things get more concerning is when we do move into the area of a discretionary supervision regime. And the concern I have here, and this is written quite well by the officials, I think, a discretionary order means that many returning offenders would not be subject to it and would therefore not receive the benefits the order may provide in terms of support for reintegration. That is an area of grave concern for us, Mr Chair, because what we're looking for when we talk about reintegration is issues which Kelvin Davis outlined in his contribution, issues like employment prospects, accommodation, health needs, community support. If we don't have a consistent regime in place here, a regime that's appropriate for each person who is returning, then we run the risk that a number of those core elements of reintegration will not be picked up. And this is the danger, Mr Chair, in this clause looking at the purpose of the bill, that we actually, in a rushed, hasty process, haven't got in front of us enough advice, in my view, as to whether those concerns raised by officials in the regulatory impact statement are met by the bill. We've got the statement that special conditions can apply. Maybe. maybe they'll apply. We don't know that for sure. And so I lack the confidence standing here today, having not seen a select committee process, having not got further advice on this matter as to whether or not those core issues about employment, accommodation, health and community support are dealt with. What we do know is that the people coming back, Mr Chair,
I call the Honourable Amy Adams.
Mr Chairman, thank you. I've just been listening